I still remember the way the paper felt like brittle skin when I first pulled it from the rusted ammo can. It was damp, smelling of old rain and something metallic that I realized later was dried blood. Before I reveal the contents of this lost message from the jungle, I invite you to subscribe to this channel to honor those who never came home. This investigation began on February 12th, 2024, when I purchased a lot of military surplus items in a small town in Ohio. Among the gear was a tattered rucksack belonging to a young man who disappeared during the Tet Offensive in 1968. The rucksack was heavy, with more than just equipment and old supplies. I unzipped the main compartment and found a small leather-bound journal wrapped in a plastic bag. It was tucked between a spare set of olive-drab socks and a half-empty bottle of water. The name Caleb Miller was written in fading black ink on the inside cover. I realized immediately that I was holding a piece of history that had been lost for over 56 years. The first entry was dated January 28, 1968, just 2 days before the massive North Vietnamese assault. Caleb was stationed at an outpost near the city of Hue, surrounded by thick canopy and a constant low-hanging mist. He wrote about the heat being so thick it felt like breathing through a wet wool blanket. "We can hear them at night," the entry said, "but we never see anything but the moving shadows." His handwriting was steady, but the words carried a weight of deep and persistent anxiety. Caleb described the routine of a soldier who knew the peace was about to shatter at any moment. He spent hours cleaning his M16 rifle, a task he performed with almost religious devotion. The humidity was 85%, and the mosquitoes were as aggressive as the enemy snipers. He mentioned a fellow soldier named Private Jackson, who would hum old gospel songs to keep the silence at bay. They were 19-year-old boys playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek in a world they did not understand. On January 30th, the tone of the journal shifted abruptly and violently. The entries became shorter, scrawled in a hurry with several words crossed out in frustration. Caleb noted that the jungle had gone completely silent, which was always a bad sign in the Central Highlands. He wrote, "Even the birds have left us. Something is coming tonight." He checked his watch at 10:45 p.m. and noted that the air felt strangely electrified and heavy. I remember reading a specific exchange he had with his sergeant that night. "Sarge, the tripwires are all quiet, but I feel like I am being watched," Caleb whispered into the dark. The sergeant just nodded and told him to keep his eyes fixed on the tree line. "Just stay frosty, kid. If it moves, it is not us," the older man replied. Those words were recorded in the journal at precisely 11:15 p.m. At 3:22 in the morning, the first mortar rounds impacted the perimeter with a deafening roar. Caleb described the sound as a series of sudden, violent thunderclaps that shook the very foundations of their bunkers. The sky turned a brilliant, terrifying shade of orange as the flares ignited above them. He threw himself into a shallow trench, clutching the journal in his left hand. The smell of cordite and burning wood filled the air within seconds of the first explosion. Men were shouting orders that were lost in the roar of the incoming fire and the screaming wind. Caleb wrote that he could not see the enemy, only the muzzle flashes erupting from the dark tree line. He fired blind into the foliage, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Jackson is down," he noted in a shaky scrawl on the corner of page 42. There was no time to grieve, only time to reload and pray for the dawn to arrive. By 4:15 a.m., their radio had been smashed by shrapnel, and they were effectively cut off. They were isolated from the main base and completely surrounded by an unknown number of attackers. Caleb described the feeling of being in a small island of light surrounded by an ocean of shadows. Every shadow seemed to be moving, creeping closer to the wire with every passing second. "We are out of flares," he wrote, "and the dark is getting deeper than I ever imagined. During a brief lull in the fighting, Caleb pulled out a photograph of his sweetheart back in Dayton. He looked at her face for only a second before tucking it back into his inner pocket. He realized then that he might never see the rolling hills of Ohio again. He wrote a quick message on the back of the photograph, just in case his body was found by the medics. "Tell her I stayed at my post. Tell her I was not afraid," the note said. The sun began to rise at 6:10 a.m., but the light only revealed more enemies approaching. The North Vietnamese soldiers were charging the wire with a ferocity that Caleb had never seen before. He was down to his last 2 magazines and his rusted bayonet. He noted that the sergeant had been hit and was bleeding out in the mud next to him. "It is just me now," the last legible sentence on the page read. I turned the page, hoping to find more, but the paper was stained with a dark, reddish-brown smear that obscured the text. The journal ended there, but the story was far from over. I realized that the ammo can held one more item beneath the rucksack. It was a small, sealed envelope that had never been opened or even touched. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized the handwriting on the envelope matched the journal perfectly. The weight of the sealed envelope felt like lead in my trembling hands as I sat in my quiet office. I knew that by breaking this seal, I was trespassing into the most private moment of a man who was likely long dead. Please subscribe to this channel and help me uncover the stories of those who were lost to the shadows of history. I sat at my wooden desk on the afternoon of February 13th, 2024, ready to open the final message of Caleb Miller. The air in the room was perfectly still, but I could almost hear the distant echoes of the jungle calling to me through the yellowed paper. The envelope was aged and stained by the same reddish-brown marks that I'd seen on the journal pages. There was no postmark and no stamp, which meant it had never been surrendered to the military mail service for delivery. The address was written in a careful, almost childlike script to a woman named Eleanor Miller in a small town called Centerville. I could tell by the pressure of the pen that Caleb had been pressing down hard, perhaps trying to steady his shaking fingers. It was a simple piece of stationery, yet it held the entire world of a 19-year-old boy who was far from home. I used a thin metal letter opener to slice through the top edge, taking great care not to damage the paper inside. My heart was thumping against my ribs as I pulled out 2 folded sheets of lined paper from the narrow opening. The smell of old tobacco and damp earth drifted up from the folds as I spread them out flat on my desk. I realized then that I was likely the first person to read these words in over 50 years of silence. The room seemed to grow darker as I began to scan the first few sentences of Caleb's final testament. "Dear Mom, I am writing this from the floor of a bunker while the world outside is falling apart," the letter began. He did not waste time with pleasantries or talk about the weather in the Highlands as he usually did in his letters. Caleb was writing with a sense of finality that was chilling to witness from my perspective in the modern day. He spoke about the cold and the fear, but he mostly spoke about the regret of things left unsaid to his family. Every word felt like a confession from a man who knew his time was running out at an incredible speed. The letter was dated January 31st, 1968, at exactly 4:45 in the morning. This was just a few hours after his last journal entry, during the absolute height of the North Vietnamese assault on his outpost. He mentioned that the ammunition was almost gone and that the enemy was currently regrouping for another massive charge. "If you are reading this, it means I did not make it off the hill alive," he wrote with a devastating honesty. I had to stop and take a deep breath before I could continue reading the second page of the letter. He asked his mother to tell his little brother, Samuel, to stay in school and never pick up a rifle for any reason. Caleb described the beauty of the Ohio sunsets and how much he missed the smell of the grass after a summer rain. He wanted her to know that he died with her name on his lips and the photograph of home in his pocket. It was a letter of profound love written in a place of absolute and total hatred. I felt a tear hit the surface of the desk as I realized the tragedy of this unmailed and forgotten goodbye. Tucked inside the second fold of the letter was a small, hand-drawn map of the area surrounding their isolated bunker. It showed a series of hills and a small stream that Caleb had labeled as Whiskey River in shaky ink. There was a small X marked near a cluster of jagged rocks that he described as their final stand against the shadows. He had written a cryptic note next to the mark that said, "The box is here if I am not." I realized that Caleb was not just writing a letter, he was leaving a trail for someone to follow into the dark. I immediately pulled up a digital military archive and searched for the coordinates of Hill 505 near Hugh. The records indicated that a small reconnaissance team had been overrun there on February 1st, 1968. According to the official report, only one soldier had been found alive, but he was in a state of deep shock and could not speak. The names of the dead were listed in alphabetical order, and my heart stopped when I saw Caleb Miller's name among the missing. He was never officially confirmed dead, only lost to the chaos and the thick canopy of the jungle. I decided to call the National Personnel Records Center to see if I could find any more information on the lone survivor. After being on hold for 22 minutes, an archivist named Martha finally answered my call with a tired voice. "We have the files for that unit, but several of them were damaged in a fire in 1973, she explained. I asked her specifically about the soldier found at the base of Hill 505 during the cleanup. She told me to wait a moment while she searched the microfilms for any mention of a survivor's name. While I waited, I looked back at the map Caleb had drawn and realized that the X was not on the outpost itself. It was nearly 200 yards away in a dense thicket of bamboo and jagged black rock. This meant Caleb had likely made a run for it during the final desperate moments of the attack. He was carrying something important, something he called the box, in his final letter to his mother. I wondered if he was trying to hide a piece of classified equipment or something far more personal and valuable. Martha came back on the line and told me that the survivor was a man named Sergeant David Thorne. He had spent 6 months in a military hospital before being discharged with a permanent mental disability. He had lived in a small cabin in northern Michigan for 30 years, before disappearing from the public record entirely. I realized that David Thorne was the sergeant Caleb had mentioned in his journal only hours before the end. If anyone knew what happened to Caleb and the mysterious box, it was the man who survived the slaughter. I began searching for any trace of David Thorne, hoping he was still alive and willing to talk about that night. I found a death certificate for a David Thorne in 2015, but the middle name did not match my records. Then I noticed a small detail in the letter that I had previously missed in my emotional state. Caleb had mentioned that he and Thorne had hidden a secret between the two brothers in the dark of the jungle. I realized then that David Thorne was not just Caleb's sergeant. He was a name that held the key to a much larger and more terrifying truth. The cold realization that Caleb and David shared more than a foxhole hit me when I cross-referenced their enlistment papers. It was a connection that changed the nature of the entire investigation from a simple recovery to a family mystery. Before we dive into the records of the Michigan woods, please subscribe to the channel and help us bring these forgotten soldiers back to the light. I spent the morning of February 14th, 2024, tracing the early life of Sergeant David Thorne. I found that he and Caleb grew up in the same foster home in Dayton during the late 1950s. They weren't just a soldier and his superior, they were brothers in every way that mattered. This explained why Caleb would trust Thorne with the location of something so sensitive during a chaotic firefight. I located a set of Social Security records that linked them to a woman named Martha Thorne. She had been their legal guardian until they both turned 18 and joined the army. It seemed they had made a pact to look out for one another before they ever stepped foot in the jungle. I turned my attention to the cabin in northern Michigan, where David Thorne had reportedly spent his final years. The property was located 3 miles outside of a town called Silver Lake, deep within the national forest. It was a remote patch of land that had no electricity and no registered phone line for over 20 years. Thorne had successfully disappeared into the wilderness, likely trying to escape the memories of Hill 505. I found a property tax record from 1998 that confirmed he was still paying for the land. The tax bill had been paid in cash at the county treasurer's office every year until 2015. This matched the date of the death certificate I had found earlier, though the middle name was still an issue. I decided to call the Silver Lake Historical Society to see if anyone remembered the hermit living in the woods. A woman named Beatrice answered the phone on the 3rd ring with a voice that sounded as old as the mountains. She told me that old Dave was a fixture of the town, even if he rarely spoke to a soul. He would come in for kerosene and canned meat once a month, Beatrice told me over the crackling line. I asked her if he ever mentioned his time in Vietnam or a soldier named Caleb Miller. There was a long silence on her end, and I could hear the sound of a clock ticking in the background. He didn't talk about the war, but he always carried a small metal box with him, she whispered. My heart skipped a beat as I realized the box from the letter had made it out of the jungle. Beatrice explained that David Thorne seemed to guard that box with his very life. He would keep it on the counter while he paid for his supplies, never letting his hand leave the handle. He told me once that it was the only thing left of his brother, she continued. I asked her what happened to the cabin after he passed away 9 years ago. She said the forest had mostly reclaimed it, but the local sheriff had never found anyone to claim his meager belongings. I knew I had to go to Michigan to see the site for myself and perhaps find a clue to the box's current location. I packed my gear and began the 10-hour drive on the morning of February 15th, 2024. The landscape shifted from the flat fields of Ohio to the dense, dark pines of the northern peninsula. The air grew colder as I climbed higher into the hills, mimicking the chill I felt in my own chest. I was chasing a ghost who had been dead for a decade, looking for a secret hidden for half a century. I reached Silver Lake just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The town was little more than a gas station and a handful of weathered houses clinging to the edge of the woods. I met Beatrice at the Historical Society, which was located in the basement of an old stone church. She handed me a hand-drawn map that David Thorne had once used to show the sheriff how to find him in case of an emergency. It was a crude drawing, but it showed a trail that led deep into the heart of the forest. Be careful up there. The woods have a way of playing tricks on your mind, Beatrice warned as she walked me to the door. I thanked her and promised to check in once I returned from the cabin site. I spent the night in a small motel, looking over Caleb's map and David's map side by side. I noticed a strange similarity in the way they both marked the location of their most important secrets. They both used a small, slanted cross that looked more like a scar than a landmark on the paper. The next morning, I drove as far as the paved road would take me before switching to my 4-wheel drive. The trail was overgrown with brush and fallen branches that scraped against the sides of my vehicle. I finally reached a point where the trees were too thick to pass, so I gathered my pack and continued on foot. The silence of the winter forest was absolute, broken only by the crunch of my boots on the thin layer of ice. I felt like I was walking through a cathedral made of pine and shadow. I found the cabin after 2 hours of hiking through the dense undergrowth. It was a small, one-room structure made of rough-hewn logs that had turned a dark charcoal gray with age. The roof had partially collapsed, and the front door was hanging open by a single rusted hinge. I stepped inside and was hit by the smell of damp wood and old cold ashes from the fireplace. In the center of the room sat a small wooden table with a single chair pulled up to it. I walked over to the corner where a small iron trunk sat half covered by a rotting wool blanket. My hands were shaking as I reached down to clear away the debris and the layers of dust. The latch was rusted shut, but I managed to pry it open with a small crowbar from my pack. Inside, I found a stack of old newspapers and a single heavy object wrapped in a tattered American flag. As I unwrapped the fabric, I saw the dull gleam of a metal box that bore a series of deep, jagged scratches. The cold metal felt like a block of ice against my palms as I lifted it from the trunk. It was heavier than it looked, weighted down by more than just metal and an old latch. Please subscribe to this channel and help me keep these historical legacies from fading away forever. I sat on the dusty floor of the cabin on the afternoon of February 16th, 2024, ready to see what David Thorne had guarded for 50 years. The silence in the woods outside seemed to intensify, as if the trees themselves were waiting for me to turn the key. The box was a standard military-issue ammunition container, but it had been modified with a heavy padlock through the latch. The scratches on the surface weren't from battle. They looked like they had been carved intentionally with a knife or a nail. I saw the initials CM and DT intertwined on the lid, surrounded by a jagged circle. It was a pact made in blood and steel, surviving decades of isolation in this remote corner of Michigan. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my hands before I used the bolt cutters from my bag. The lock snapped with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot in the small, empty room. I slowly lifted the lid, expecting to find gold, or perhaps more letters to Eleanor Miller. Instead, the first thing I saw was a thick layer of oily cloth, carefully folded to protect the contents from the humidity. Beneath the cloth lay a heavy black object that I immediately recognized as a field radio component. It was a frequency scrambler, a piece of equipment that should have been turned into the military authorities in 1968. Next to the radio part was a small bundle of Polaroids held together by a thick rubber band that had long since perished. I picked up the first photo and felt a sudden jolt of electricity run through my fingers. It showed Caleb and David standing in front of a helicopter, grinning like they didn't have a care in the world. They looked so young, their faces free of the shadows that would eventually consume both of them. I flipped the photo over and saw the date, January 10th, 1968, scrawled in Caleb's handwriting. The second photo was much different, taken in the dim light of a bunker or perhaps a cave. It showed a wooden crate filled with small wrapped packages that bore no markings or labels of any kind. David Thorne was standing in the background, but he wasn't smiling. He looked terrified, his eyes darting toward something off camera. The shadows in the corner of the frame seemed to be moving, or perhaps it was just the trick of the old film. I realized then that the box Caleb mentioned wasn't just about a letter or a secret. I found a small, handwritten ledger tucked into the side of the container, its pages filled with columns of numbers and dates. It wasn't a military log. It looked like a record of transactions, or perhaps an inventory of something illicit. There were names of towns in South Vietnam that I had seen in history books, followed by amounts in American dollars. One entry stood out, dated January 25, 1968, for the amount of $50,000. This was a fortune for two young soldiers who were making less than $300 a month. The deeper I looked, the more the heroic image of Caleb Miller began to shift into something more complex and dangerous. I found a map of the Hue region, but it wasn't a standard patrol map used by the infantry. It had specific routes marked in red ink that avoided the main roads and the established military outposts. These were the back paths of the jungle, the trails used by smugglers and perhaps those who worked in the shadows. I felt a sense of betrayal on behalf of the mother who had waited so long for her son's return. Beneath the map was a small velvet bag that felt heavy and shifted with a metallic clink when I touched it. I opened the drawstring and poured the contents into my hand, expecting coins or perhaps jewelry from the city. Instead, 20 small, uncut diamonds spilled out onto the dusty floor of the cabin. They were raw and unpolished, but they caught the faint light coming through the collapsed roof. I realized that the box was the reason Caleb and David had been targeted on Hill 505. The X on Caleb's map wasn't just a place to hide, it was where they had buried the rest of this haul. They had taken a small portion with them, leaving the bulk of the riches behind in the thick bamboo of the highlands. David Thorne had spent 30 years in these woods, not just to hide from the war, but to guard the evidence of their crime. He was waiting for someone, or perhaps he was too afraid of what might happen if he ever tried to sell the stones. The weight of the secret had been his true prison for over 5 decades. I looked back at the ledger and noticed a final note written in a different handwriting on the very last page. It was dated February 2nd, 1968, the day after the outpost was reportedly overrun. "He is gone, and the debt is not yet paid," the scrawl said, the ink looking hurried and desperate. I recognized the handwriting from the death certificate I had seen in the county records. It belonged to David Thorne, written while he was likely still in the military hospital after the slaughter. I sat there in the silence, surrounded by the remnants of a life built on a foundation of secrets and blood. The diamonds felt cold in my hand, a silent witness to a betrayal that had cost Caleb Miller his life. I wondered if Eleanor ever knew that her son had been involved in something so far beyond the scope of a simple war. The hero of Dayton was a myth created to cover a reality that was far more grounded in human greed. I realized then that my investigation was no longer about a missing soldier, but about a missing fortune. As I prepared to pack the items back into the box, I heard a floorboard creak in the back of the cabin. It was a distinct, deliberate sound that did not belong to the wind or the shifting of the old structure. I froze, my hand still clutching the velvet bag of diamonds, as a shadow fell across the open doorway. I realized that I wasn't as alone in these woods as I had originally thought. The person standing there had been watching me for a long time, and they were finally ready to claim what they believed was theirs. The silhouette against the blinding white snow was tall and thin, casting a jagged shadow that stretched across the floorboards to my feet. My heart was pounding so hard, I felt it in my fingertips as I gripped the velvet bag of diamonds tighter. Before I reveal the face of the man who stood in that doorway, I invite you to subscribe to the channel so these hidden truths are never buried again. It was 3:35 in the afternoon on February 16th, 2024, and the silence of the Michigan wilderness had finally been broken. I realized then that David Thorne's secrets had been watched by more than just the silent trees for all these years. The man was older, perhaps in his late 60s, wearing a heavy canvas coat that had seen decades of hard use. He didn't have a weapon, but his presence was as commanding as any armed guard I had ever encountered in my research. His eyes were a pale, piercing blue that seemed to cut right through the dim light of the cabin. He looked at the metal box on the table, and then back at me with a look of weary recognition. "You shouldn't have opened that," he said, in a voice that sounded like grinding gravel and dry leaves. I slowly stood up, keeping my hands visible to show I wasn't a threat to him or the property. I asked him who he was and how he knew David Thorne lived in this isolated piece of forest. He took a step inside, the old floorboards groaning under his weight as he moved toward the center of the room. "I'm Thomas, David's nephew, and I've been the one paying those taxes in cash since 2015, he replied. He sat down in the single chair by the table, looking like a man who had been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. Thomas explained that David had contacted him shortly before his death, revealing the existence of the cabin and the box. He told me that his uncle was terrified of the diamonds and the blood that had been spilled to acquire them. David believed the stones were cursed, bringing nothing but death and madness to anyone who touched them. He spent 30 years out here trying to atone for what happened on Hill 505, Thomas whispered. I watched as he reached out to touch the scratched initials on the lid of the ammunition container. According to Thomas, the smuggling ring wasn't Caleb's idea, but a scheme concocted by high-ranking officers in Hugh. Caleb and David were just the couriers, the two boys from Dayton who were small enough to move through the jungle without attracting notice. They were supposed to deliver the diamonds to a contact near the coast on the night of the Tet Offensive. Instead, the world exploded around them, and they found themselves trapped with a fortune they never wanted. They chose to hide the loot rather than hand it over to the men who had sent them to die. I asked Thomas about the ledger and the names of the buyers listed in those cramped, frantic columns. He told me that those weren't just buyers, but the men who had hunted David for years after he returned to the States. That's why he lived like a ghost. He wasn't just hiding from the memories, Thomas explained. There were people in Washington and Saigon who still wanted their cut of the missing $50,000. The box was the only insurance policy David had against the men who wanted him silenced forever. Thomas looked at the velvet bag in my hand and told me that the 20 diamonds were only a small fraction of the total haul. The rest were still in Vietnam, buried exactly where the X on Caleb's map indicated. Caleb had stayed behind to defend the spot while David made a run for it with the radio and the ledger. Caleb didn't die in the attack. He was executed by his own side for refusing to give up the location, Thomas said. I felt a cold chill settle in my stomach as the image of the hero of Dayton shattered completely. The story of the lone survivor was a lie constructed by the military to keep the smuggling ring from being exposed to the public. David Thorne had been told to keep his mouth shut or face a court-martial for the very crimes his superiors had ordered. He spent the rest of his life in a state of constant paranoia, moving from state to state until he found this cabin. He kept the ledger as a way to prove who the real criminals were if they ever came for him. The diamonds were just a reminder of the price Caleb had paid for their shared greed. The name on the back of the photo was General Richard Vance, the man who had overseen the entire region during the Tet Offensive. Before I explain how a 4-star general ended up in a private photo with a 19-year-old private, I ask you to subscribe to the channel to support this hunt for the truth. I stood there in the freezing Michigan cabin, staring at the face of a man who had been a hero to millions. The realization that he was the architect of this smuggling ring felt like a physical blow to my stomach. It was no longer a story about two soldiers. It was a story about the corruption of power at the highest level. Thomas watched me as I processed the information, his face illuminated by the cold light of the doorway. He told me that his uncle David had spent years trying to gather enough evidence to prove Vance was the mastermind. The general had been the one who signed the orders for the reconnaissance missions on Hill 505. It wasn't about tactical position or enemy movement, but about logistics for the diamond shipments. Every life lost on that hill was a sacrifice for a man sitting in a comfortable office in Saigon. I took a high-resolution photo of the picture with my phone to ensure I had a digital copy of the evidence. The man in the suit looked confident, his hand resting on Caleb's shoulder as if they were old friends. Caleb looked uncomfortable, his eyes fixed on the ground rather than the camera lens. It was a visual record of a pact that should never have existed between such different ranks. I wondered how many other young boys had been recruited for similar special duties during the conflict. Vance died in 1994, but his estate is still managed by a powerful legal firm in Washington, Thomas explained. He handed me the ledger, which contained specific dates of shipments that coincided with Vance's official travel schedule. The diamonds weren't just being moved through the jungle. They were being flown out in diplomatic pouches and private military transports. The scale of the operation was staggering, involving millions of dollars in untraceable raw gemstones. It was a shadow economy running parallel to the carnage of the war. I asked Thomas why David never went to the press with this information during the 1970s or 80s. He told me that David had tried once, but he was nearly killed in a mysterious hit-and-run accident in Baltimore. After that, he realized that the reach of the people involved was far greater than he had ever imagined. He retreated to this cabin, living like a ghost to protect himself and the secrets in the box. He chose survival over justice, a decision that had haunted him until his final breath. I packed the items carefully into my bag, feeling the weight of the diamonds and the ledger like a heavy burden. Thomas told me that he wanted nothing to do with the physical evidence, as it only brought him fear. Just tell the story. Let people know that Caleb wasn't a criminal, he was a victim, he said firmly. I promised him that I would handle the material with the respect it deserved and continue the investigation. We walked out of the cabin together, leaving the rotting wood and the memories behind us in the snow. The hike back to my vehicle felt longer than the walk in, my mind racing with the implications of the Vance connection. I reached my truck at 5:45 in the evening and started the engine to get the heater running. The silence of the forest seemed to have a different quality now, one that felt more like a warning than a peace. I drove back towards Silver Lake, my eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror for any signs of being followed. The paranoia that had consumed David Thorne was starting to take root in my own mind. I spent the night in a different motel 2 towns away, needing to feel like I had put some distance between myself and the cabin. I spread the ledger pages out on the bed and began cross-referencing the dates with official military records I had downloaded. Every single shipment listed by David matched a major military operation or a high-level diplomatic visit. The logistics were flawless, using the chaos of the Tet Offensive as a perfect smokescreen for the largest diamond heist in military history. It was a brilliant, cold-blooded plan that relied on the deaths of young men to succeed. I found a name in the ledger that appeared more frequently than any other: the Fixer. This individual seemed to be the bridge between General Vance and the soldiers on the ground, like Caleb and David. There was an address listed for a business in Bangkok that had specialized in precious stones during the late 1960s. I realized that to understand the full scope of the crime, I had to find out who was operating that business. The paper trail was old and dusty, but the ink was starting to reveal a path that led far beyond the borders of Vietnam. At 2:15 in the morning, I found a digital scan of a 1969 newspaper article from an international gazette. It mentioned a man named Elias Thorne, no relation to David, who had been arrested for smuggling but was released after a lack of evidence. Elias was the one managing the Bangkok office and had served under Vance during the Korean War. The network was a brotherhood of corruption that had lasted for decades, spanning multiple conflicts and continents. It was a closed loop that few outsiders had ever been allowed to see, let alone survive. I looked at the diamonds again, realizing they were the physical proof that could bring down a legacy of lies. 20 raw stones, each one representing a life lost or a soul broken in the pursuit of wealth. I wondered if the legal firm in Washington knew the true source of the Vance fortune that they were still protecting. If I released this information, I would be challenging some of the most powerful families in the country. It was a terrifying prospect, but the memory of Caleb's unmailed letter to his mother kept me focused. I decided that my next stop would be to visit the law firm of Sterling and Associates in Washington under the guise of a historical researcher. I needed to see their reaction when I mentioned the name of the Bangkok business and the dates in the ledger. As I began to pack my papers, I noticed a small, folded note that had been hidden in the spine of the ledger. It was a message from David to whoever found the box, and it contained a single, terrifying instruction. I realized then that the most dangerous part of the box wasn't the diamonds, but a key to a vault that hadn't been opened since 1968. The small brass key was cold against my thumb, etched with the number 712 and the initials of a bank that had long since been absorbed by a larger corporation. Before I take you into the final vault where this conspiracy was laid bare, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and help us honor the soldiers history tried to erase. I arrived in Washington, D.C., and on the morning of February 18, 2024, carrying the ledger and the diamonds in a locked briefcase. The city felt different to me now, its grand monuments looking more like masks for the secrets buried beneath the limestone. I spent 3 hours at the National Archives before heading to the basement of a historic building on Pennsylvania Avenue. The bank vault was located in a sub-basement that felt like it hadn't seen a visitor since 1968. I handed the key to a clerk named Robert, who looked at the old brass as if it were a relic from another dimension. He led me through a heavy steel door into a room filled with thousands of small, numbered compartments. We stopped at box 712, and I felt a surge of adrenaline as the dual keys turned in the lock. The drawer slid out with a metallic groan, revealing a thick stack of manila envelopes and several microfilm reels. I spent the next 4 hours in a small private viewing room, illuminated only by the flicker of the microfilm reader. The documents weren't just about diamonds. They were the original manifests for the shipments, each one signed with the unmistakable flourish of General Richard Vance. There were maps of private airfields in Laos and Thailand that had been used to bypass military customs for over 5 years. I found a series of telegrams between Vance and the Fixer discussing the disposal of assets on Hill 505. This was the definitive proof that Caleb and David had been silenced to protect a $1 million smuggling operation. Among the papers was a handwritten note from Caleb Miller, dated January 25, 1968, the same day he made his last journal entry. It was a formal request for a transfer, citing unethical activities he had witnessed within the unit's logistics department. He had tried to do the right thing through the proper channels, and it had effectively signed his death warrant. He realized his letters were being intercepted and his life was in immediate danger. He had hidden this duplicate evidence in the vault as a failsafe, trusting David to find the key if he didn't make it. I realized then that Sterling and Associates weren't just managing Vance's estate, they were the guardians of his dark legacy. I decided not to walk into their office, knowing that the evidence I held was worth more than my life to people like them. Instead, I spent the afternoon at a high-end scanning service, creating 3 digital backups of every single document and photo. I sent one copy to a trusted investigative journalist and another to a cold case unit at the Department of Justice. The original ledger and the diamonds were placed in a new, secure location that only I could access. As I walked out into the cold February air, I felt the heavy weight of the last 2 weeks finally starting to lift. The story of Caleb Miller and David Thorne was no longer a secret buried in a Michigan cabin or a Vietnamese jungle. It was a matter of public record, a testament to 2 foster brothers who had been caught in a web of greed far beyond their control. I thought about Eleanor Miller and how she had lived her entire life without knowing the true heroism of her son. He hadn't just been a soldier. He had been a whistleblower who refused to be corrupted by the gold in his rucksack. I drove back to Ohio on February 19th, 2024, to find the final piece of the puzzle. I located the grave of Eleanor Miller in a quiet, overgrown cemetery on the outskirts of Dayton. She had passed away in 1992, never having received the final letter Caleb had written in that dark bunker. I knelt in the damp grass and placed the unmailed envelope on the weathered headstone, weighted down by a small stone from the Michigan woods. "He never stopped trying to get home to you," I whispered into the wind. The investigation had reached its end, but the impact of what I had found was only beginning to ripple outward. Within 48 hours of my digital delivery, the investigative journalist contacted me with a list of names that matched the heirs of the Vance fortune. Several prominent figures in the capital were now facing the reality of a 50-year-old crime coming to light. The diamonds, once a symbol of betrayal and death, were turned over to a non-profit organization that assists the families of the missing in action. Every gemstone was sold to fund the search for other soldiers who were still lost in the thick canopy of the jungle. I returned to my office and sat at the desk where this entire journey had begun with a rusted ammo can. The rucksack and the empty journal sat in the corner, looking like ordinary relics of a war that had ended decades ago. I realized that David Thorne's 30 years of silence hadn't been a sign of cowardice, but a long, slow act of preservation. He had waited for someone with the curiosity and the heart to follow the trail he and Caleb had blazed. He had finally succeeded in his mission, and his soul could finally find the peace that had eluded him in life. The legacy of Hill 505 was no longer defined by a military report or a nameless casualty list. It was defined by the courage of a 19-year-old boy who wrote a letter to his mother while the world was exploding around him. I spent the evening of February 20th, 2024, writing the final entry in my own logbook. I recorded the names of the Foster brothers from Dayton, ensuring they would be remembered as heroes rather than smugglers. The truth had been a hard-won prize, but it was the only thing that could truly honor the dead. As the sun set over the Ohio fields, I looked at the photograph of Caleb and David one last time before filing it away. They were smiling again, frozen in a moment of youth and friendship before the weight of the diamonds had pulled them apart. I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected to find in the dusty corners of military surplus and old safes. The investigation was closed, the secret was told, and the ghosts of the Central Highlands could finally rest. I had done what David Thorne couldn't do alone, and I had seen the light return to a story that had been dark for 56 years. I closed the briefcase and stood up, ready to step back into my own life after living in someone else's shadow for so long. The soldier's diary had revealed its most painful chapter, but it had also shown the resilience of the human spirit. There are countless other boxes hidden in attics and basements, each one holding a voice that is waiting to be heard. I am ready to find them, to listen to the whispers of the past, and to ensure that no soldier is ever truly forgotten. The journey continues, and the next story is already waiting just beyond the horizon of history. I realized then that the reddish-brown stains on the journal weren't from an enemy mortar round at all. They were the marks of a struggle between two brothers who had been pushed to the edge of sanity. Caleb had wanted to turn the diamonds in, hoping for a clean slate, but David knew they would never be allowed to live if they did. The letter to Eleanor was Caleb's last attempt to make things right before the darkness finally took him. I looked at the unmailed envelope and felt a deep, hollow sadness for the mother who never knew the truth. Thomas told me that he had no interest in the diamonds or the money they represented in the modern market. He only wanted the ledger so he could finally understand the man who had been his mysterious, silent uncle. "Keep the stones if you want them, but the names in that book belong to history," he said firmly. I looked at the raw, unpolished gems and realized they were worth a fortune. but they felt like pieces of lead in my hand. I wondered if I could ever walk away from this cabin and leave the secret behind. We sat in the fading light for another hour, talking about the boys from Dayton and the war that had broken them. Thomas showed me a small locket David had kept, containing a lock of hair and a small piece of blue ribbon. It was the only other thing in the cabin that didn't smell of oil, smoke, or old secrets. I realized that David Thorne hadn't just been guarding a box. He had been guarding the only human connection he had left. He was a man who had survived the jungle only to spend the rest of his life in a different kind of cage. As I prepared to leave, Thomas handed me a small yellowed photograph that had been tucked into the back of the ledger. It showed Caleb Miller standing next to a man I didn't recognize, both of them dressed in civilian clothes. The man was much older, wearing a suit that looked expensive even in the grainy, old-fashioned print. Thomas pointed to the man and whispered a name that made my heart stop in my chest. It was a name I had seen in every history book about the war, and I realized the conspiracy went much higher than a few corrupt officers.